Hello and welcome to the Volleycast. I am your host, Joe Trinzi. And on the other line, the best duo since Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker. It's David Hunt and Andrew Strick. How you guys doing?
Doing well, Joe. Joe, do you write those? Is that what you're really doing all day? Is you're just writing those down or what?
If it took me all day to think of jokes that bad, that would be pretty sad for me.
But you're not saying it doesn't take you that long.
You're not wrong. You're absolutely not wrong there. If you two were a buddy cop duo, who would be the rebellious, the rebellious one, and who would be like the rule, what would be the buddy cop dynamic between the two of you?
Ooh,
The other guys.
The other guys? Who would be Strick? Would you be Will Ferrell then?
Oh, yeah.
I think, yeah. But then Strick wins because, Will Ferrell's wife is hot.
That's an excellent point. Dave, you could probably beat Mark Wahlberg in an arm wrestling contest. So I think that works.
Maybe.
You have no excuse to not be jacked right now. None of us.
That's what I'm saying. We talked about that the other day. Excuses are out the window, right? Like,
Absolutely.
everyone knows that you're lying now if you just make up an excuse.
Yeah, no, I don't have time. Everyone has time. That's all we have is time.
Right. Yeah.
Speaking of time, we want to make training more efficient. Let's talk about one specific concept that we'll keep this episode pretty short. We'll talk about one specific concept, Dave, that kind of came up yesterday when we were talking. And that's this sort of idea of, I've heard it's maybe like called differential learning in the motor learning circle, but I may not be using that right. But it's the idea of creating some sort of deliberate contrast in your learning to learn from there. So for example, we were talking about hitters learning how to refine their tempo by alternating between hitting a fast set and a high ball. Or also blockers learning how to get their blocking eye work better by blocking against an alternating tempo. So of course there's just this idea of sort of like introducing more variance like in a random concept. We know that has some benefits. But to me, there's something there where the coach deliberately like expanding the normal bounds of what the athlete would see has some more so maybe than just random practice. It seems like there's some benefits there. So Strick, I'll ask you, put that in some of the, what are the scientific terms? Like what's the motor learning research kind of saying? Like what's the better labels? I tend to call this like contrast training, but is that the correct term to use, or is there a better term I could be using?
Yeah, in motor learning research, we call this contextual interference. And essentially what contextual interference does, it has an effect. So basically, it describes that if you introduce randomness in practice or more variations in practice, so you do ABC, CBA, AAB, whatever the sequence of moves may be, as long as it's random, the learner will not perform well in practice. But upon the following day, when they're asked to perform the task, on retention, they perform much better than someone that learned something blocked, which is like AAA, BBB, CCC. And that's what it is.
Andrew, and then is there an added level of if the learner gets to choose the pattern or gets to choose, if you give them four, like maybe if we're teaching serving, if we give them four seams, or if I'm a passer and I put out four different targets they would never normally have to make angles to, and they choose where they want it to go, does that add a level of learning or does it enhance it, or what's the concept behind doing that?
Yeah, so that's a good question to ask. So what David's bringing into is this idea of self-controlled practice, that the learner is guiding the practice regimen that they perform. And we've seen studies where that has been proven to show better results than if the coach controls the practice in a blocked fashion. There's
a piece there that's a little different than just the blocked versus random that I want to hone in on. And that's, so say we're going to pass I'm a receiver and I'm going to pass the ball. If you give me like the sort of random serves that I'm going to see in a game, there's a lot of randomness and the unpredictability is high. But for lack of a better term, the range of inputs is actually not super high. Well, it is what it is. What I mean is, and Dave kind of touched on it to use a passing example, there's a sort of comfortable height level, for example, that I'm going to start passing those balls. I'm going to kind of, and essentially what it's going to be is to whatever I feel is going to make me most successful. I'm going to try to perform the most successful rep. But say we deliberately alter the conditions, this is a little bit of this constraints-based learning. Say we deliberately alter the conditions and say, okay, you have to pass one extra high, and then you have to pass one extra low. And then your third one, just pass it, maybe however you want to pass it, or pass it for a point or something like that. And then go deliberately high and get deliberately low. So you're sort of deliberately pushing out the boundary conditions that the athlete would normally operate under. And what I find this effective is when athletes when they're kind of in a rut, for lack of a better term, and they keep trying to create what I guess they view as the optimal solution, but it ain't getting the job done. So if you kind of almost introduce some sort of constraint that forces them to have like a wider boundary than they would normally operate under, sometimes I feel like that unlocks something.
Gotcha. And what are you trying to ask here?
Hold on 1 second, Joe. Let me decode that for you. When Andrew tells me gotcha, that means you're wrong. That's incorrect.
He's trying to search for like
a
polite way to tell me that's stupid, I think. But
I mean, there could be a genuine misunderstanding, but most of the time when he tells me that, that's a nice way of saying like, you are a layman and you have no idea what you're talking about. Just letting you know, but continue, Andrew.
I mean, I'm just asking for clarification of what he means by this, like unlocking kind of that he's perceiving.
So what I mean is, so I'll tell you again with passing, like to use that because I've used this with some passers. And I guess what I'll say is like, when I ask passers to do this sort of deliberate exercise, sometimes I'll struggle with it. So I'll say, okay, we'll do 3 balls in a row. And the first ball you'll put right to the tape. And the third ball, you got to pass it high at the 10-foot line. Or the second ball, you pass high on the 10-foot line. The third ball, you try to pass it perfect, like you would a sort of normal passing rep. So I see 2 things. One, a lot of times mediocre passers really struggle to vary their location of their passes, as you would expect. Like, okay, an advanced passer has more control over their passing. And what I see with passers is when they go through this exercise, for example, and you can imagine creating similar exercises for other skills. When they go through this exercise, all of a sudden they realize they don't have as much control over their arms or their angle or something as they wanted to. And they start getting a little bit more deliberate about where they're trying to control the ball. So I don't know if it's this contrast, and I don't know if it's just the contrast tends to be a very externally focused, like just the nature of it, because you're really focusing on deliberately changing the effect of your movement. Like, so you really can't focus on your arms. Like, you can't be internal when you're trying to think about like, okay, I got to pass this ball extra high and I got to pass this ball low and flat or something like that. So it may be just that the whole solution here is external, but I don't know if there's some advantage to like deliberately altering your normal sort of like groove of how you would perform the motor skill.
Yeah, I think there is a benefit to having variation within the practice regimen, which is again contextual interference. By requesting that the athlete perform the skill with different solutions per se, meaning the height is different, they're focused on constructing motor programs that elicit that benefit or elicit that change. And I want to make sure I rephrase before that David talked about self-controlled practice, that I didn't mean to say blocked as the as the second condition. It's self-controlled versus not being able to choose.
Yeah. Dave, have you done anything like this in your coaching? Like the one thing that made me think about is when we're talking about like the blockers, like instead of just, okay, blocking against an offense that's trying to score, it's like, you know, okay, you're going to see a high ball and then you're going to see a fastball and then you're going to see a high ball and you're going to see a fastball. And it seems like something about experiencing that contrast one after the other has some sort of learning effect. But I don't know how to totally put my finger on it.
Yeah, I think, Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think we've tried to come up with something for every skill, you know, regarding this idea of contextual interference, or making, you know, I think, Andrew, the phrase, how you phrased it to me was making the task more difficult than it would be in a match, right? So a passer having to set an angle that's pretty extreme, maybe it's over near a pole, but they would never have to set an angle like that, just making them aware of their platform. I don't think we've introduced heights, but that's the same idea. Blocking, we use that example. Serving, you know, I think that was probably where we started with Andrew, with just how can we design these, and then we had to put them into a scale that was appropriate. But just the idea of here's an appropriate stimulus, and then the idea of everyone on your team is not at the same level. So then how do we make it harder for some and appropriate for all varying types of learners? And would you say that's accurate, Andrew?
Yeah, that's fairly accurate to what we were talking about in the Pepperdine gym. Is we wanted to have variance among the passing, so we would work on different seams and work on the ball being in different locations and working with different teammates and having that in variation. And we found that to have great success in our gym.
And I think some of the challenges as a coach, and we all experience it, is some athletes have a better concept than others. So how do you make it appropriate for them? And how do you make it appropriate for them without discouraging others, specifically when you don't have time to pull an athlete out and only train them individually? But how can you introduce these ideas with everyone on your team, but still making it appropriate for them? And so that's a lot of our conversation, I think. And that's a lot of the conversation in coaching or amongst staffs.
And I want to make sure I compound this with what Joe was trying to specify about what's going on with these contrasts. You see that the more different the different exercises are, meaning that the height is changed and maybe the location of the pass will change, the more the learner has to reprogram how their platform is controlled. And so they have to really focus to do that. And so the more different it is, the more learning takes place because they have to focus more on what they're doing.
I'll kind of even take this a step further, and I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are on this. So we've all kind of coached a player that has, so for lack of a better term, like a recurring flaw. Say they're a server, and they tend to toss the ball behind them, right? They don't get the ball out in front of them enough. And it's like a pretty clear flaw. Like, okay, it's pretty easy to see. So, and the natural tendency, I think, when you coach, hey, keep your toss further out, or you give them all these, whether it's you have some better external cueing towards, whatever you make it. And the goal is to try to get the toss further out. I've often found sometimes a fairly effective fix to that is to say, okay, next serve, I want you to deliberately toss the ball behind your head. Like, I want you to deliberately make the error. And then like overcompensate forward. And then hit your third one, just hit it for a result. And then deliberately make the error. So I've actually found like some benefit in that I don't know, athletes, I don't know what it is exactly there, but sometimes like deliberately making the error almost turns a light bulb on. And to me, I don't know if it's like a similar thing, or if you guys have any thoughts on that, but I've seen some light bulbs turn on, like when they get off this, like, I don't want to say like always trying to do it right, but like they're chasing this pattern that they can't create. And sometimes when they understand better about what the mistake is, then the fix becomes easier. I don't know.
And I think what you're also doing by product of this kind of training is you're teaching them with contextual interference the ideal toss. You're having one too far back, one too far forward, and then this ideal in between. And so they're learning by randomness of toss height or toss length or whatever to get that optimal solution for themselves.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just like, yeah, like if it's like kind of like a reorienting your mean, because you're always going to have some, like when you're trying to, if you're shooting foul shots, you're going to make some of them, and then there's going to be some variation around the mean. And like whoever your mean is, the variation is going to be pretty evenly distributed. And for some players, their variation is like where they're trying to get it to is at like the end range of their variance, not the mean of their variance. So it's like you have to like totally reprogram the boundaries almost, and then they can refine the median where they like refine the middle where it needs to be. But like they start narrowing, because I think that's one effective training. We kind of talked about this last time, is one effective training. Because Dave, you were sort of saying like, on average, passers really don't get much better during the year. And part of me, we were sort of saying is like, yeah, a lot of training tends not to really make players better, but sort of reduce their variance. And reducing your variance can make you better. Like if you're sort of middle ground is where it needs, is like a productive action, then reducing the variance around that middle ground is a really productive strategy. And that's, I think, most of what coaches do. Most of what like practice is sort of, your standard practice is sort of designed to do, is sort of just kind of like eliminate the aberrant plays. But when you're performing the skill in a way that's kind of substandard, reducing the variance just sort of like makes you more consistently substandard, as opposed to like having some deliberate change in the boundaries allows you to kind of recalibrate your mean. And I'm using like these like really fuzzy concepts. So I'm just trying to like dial in on like how I could sharpen this idea up. Because it's one of these things where I kind of like seen by practice, but I want to like be able to hone it in a little bit better. I want to know like what I'm doing that like really has some proof behind it, and what I'm doing that is, I'm just false attribution or something. So.
Gotcha. As far as the idea that consistency is part of an evolution for better motor programs, yeah, definitely. And that you want to increase performance and velocity, consistency, strength in some cases, or whatever it may be. Those are all on that continuum of what it takes to be a novice to become an expert. And so if the ideal solution is not being met, it doesn't mean that you have to force a learner into an ideal solution. It may be that you have to adjust to what is optimal for them. And I think that we have to find that balance between like, okay, there's this perfect, quote unquote, perfect way to handle a jump serve or jump spike serve, but it also might be to have some allowance for the athlete to experiment with that to figure out what's best for them too. And I think a lot of coaches get this like this perfection idea of what it's supposed to look like, and not allowing the athlete to be individualized for them.
Yeah, definitely a good point there.
And Andrew, this is a conversation that we touch on a lot. What is that number of, to have an athlete that maybe is struggling with a skill and we need to dial it back so there's less interference as they're trying to learn that skill? But at what point do I sort of turn the knob and make it a little tougher on them?
The general rule of thumb that we have found as a practitioner point of view is that if there's like this 50% success rate, 50% fail rate, you're doing a pretty good job of calibrating what you need to do to get your training emphasis done.
And would that even be a skill where we're trying to serve in obviously a lot higher, at least most teams are. Is there a rate at which, do you move that up, or is it always regarding this technical skill? If he can do it 50% of the time, he or she can do it 50% of the time, then I'm adding a little more interference.
I like using that general thumb. I'm not basing it on like the literature as a practitioner. Yeah. That's what I'm basing it on. That's what I've found to be very successful for athletes.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
So in that case, you'd have to redefine a successful serve, for example, to be in plus this speed or in this zone or something like that, where they can meet that 50% of the time.
Correct. Yeah. And it adds a layer of difficulty, and it adds more interference for them to worry about. So I'm not just getting it in, because once you get to the collegiate level, most guys can get it in. So it's about, can I get it into my zone at the right speed? Now that's pretty tough to do.
Most guys can get it in, but all guys can hit it 65 miles an hour into the stands, and that's all that matters. All right, good topic. One thing that kind of leads me into that we don't have time to get into today, so maybe we're going to talk about it, is what is the ideal winning percentage for a team that's trying to develop? So I'll leave that as a cliffhanger, and I don't know if there's a solution to that, but that makes me wonder a lot about juniors volleyball. Should I schedule then for a 50% winning, like a 500 winning percentage, or are there some other factors that get into it? So maybe we'll address that. Maybe we'll address that next time. And in the meantime, would love to hear anybody, all the listeners' takes on this. You can tweet us at the Volleycast or shoot us another thing. Have you used any of these sort of contrast methods or ways to increase the contextual interference? What are some of your favorite ways to do it? Let us know on that. And if you want to weigh in on this topic before we talk about it if you're trying to just purely look at development, so say you're a club team and say you're a 16 and under club team, where theoretically you could schedule the best 18 and under teams in the country and you'd almost surely lose that match, or you could schedule nothing but like 14 and unders and you'd go undefeated. There's probably some balance in there. So is it 500 or is it a little more, is it a little less? What's kind of the ideal scheduling for learning? So I think that's, I've heard that from club directors and all of that. So get on and talk about that. And we got some other good stuff coming up. This Saturday, we got Alfie Refs coming on for our next premium webinar talking about defense. That's all sold out. That's sold out earlier this morning. So we will put that one up for sale if you guys want to catch that later. We got the Tom Black webinar for sale. We got the Chris Thomasetti webinar for sale. And then the next one after Alfie, if you didn't get a chance to see him, we got, I think, 5 more spots left for Dan Fisher talking about attacking on Sunday the 19th. So that's almost 2 weeks away, but only 5 spots left on that one. So sign up now if you want to get them. And thanks for listening to the Volleycast.